Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome friends to this third lecture of week 8 of this course environmental soil chemistry, and in the previous two lectures we have covered some of the important inorganic pollutants of soil. For example, we have covered nitrogen, phosphorus, then arsenic, chloride and salts, and we have also covered eutrophication processes, which is mediated by excess enrichment of nitrogen and phosphorus. So, today we are going to start from here, and we are going to start with cadmium. Now, cadmium, you know, there is a group 2b, it is a transition metal and with an atomic weight of 112.41, and it has the common oxidation states of 2. So, cadmium 2 plus is the most common oxidation state. So, what are among the forms, the most common form is the cadmium sulphide, and the other forms are hydroxides and complex ions with ammonia or cyanide, and different complex organic amines and sulfur complexes, and chelates can also one of the important forms of cadmium. Now, cadmium also forms insoluble compounds usually hydrated with carbonate, arsenate, phosphate or oxalate ions. And what are the sources of cadmium? The major sources of cadmium are soil parent materials, sludges and effluents, mainly industrial sludges and effluents, fertilizers, atmospheric fallout and radioactive waste disposal. Now, what are the sources of cadmium in the soil environment? If you see the concentration of cadmium in the soil, it is basically varies from less than 0.1 to 10 ppm, and the distribution in soil, if you see the distribution in soil, cadmium is fairly mobile and almost uniformly distributed. But in polluted areas, cadmium concentration found high in the upper layers of the soil. Now, different phases of, if you consider different phases of cadmium in soils, first of all is the exchangeable phase, which is basically showing the adsorption of cadmium by negatively charged exchange sites on clays, organic particulates and hydrous oxides. And second phase is reducible or hydrous oxide phase, which shows the adsorption or co-precipitation with oxides, hydroxides and hydrous oxides of iron, manganese and possibly aluminum present in the coatings of clay or other discrete particles. And third phase is the carbonate phase, and carbonate phase basically shows the carbonate precipitation in alkaline soil with high amount of free calcium carbonate, bicarbonate and phosphate. So, basically in the carbonate phase, obviously there is a high carbonate precipitation. In case of hydrous oxide phase, you will see the dominance of different oxides and hydrous oxides of iron, manganese and aluminum. So, these phases and also exchangeable phases. So, these are the three major phases of cadmium in soil, which you can see frequently. So, if we go ahead and see other phases, among the other phases are organic phase, complexation with organic fraction by chelation, cadmium showed chelation, and the complex these chelates may vary in stability from easily decomposable to moderately resistant to decomposition, and also cadmium can be found in lattice phase. So, lattice phase shows the fixation within the crystalline lattice of mineral particles, sometimes known as the residual fraction. The another phase is called the sulphide phase. Now, sulphide phase is very insoluble and stable compound of cadmium sulphides occurring in poorly aerated soils such as rice paddy soils, where sulphur toxicity can occur. And also the solution phases. Now, in the solution phase, cadmium exists in soil solution in either the ionic or complex form. Now, these phases altogether with the initial cadmium concentration as well as soil moisture and the moisture status and temperature define the cadmium forms of or species. So, these are the major phases of cadmium which we frequently encounter in the soil. Now, obviously, cadmium is one of the major source of soil pollution as well as water pollution. You can see here, I have shown here one picture which shows cadmium and lead pollution in China. So, cadmium is one of the potential pollutant for soil as well as water. Now, if I move to the next one, that is called chromium. Chromium is a 6b element and with an atomic weight of 51.996. With the isotopes, they have 4 stable isotopes, 5 radioactive isotopes. The one mostly used as the trace bearing is 51 chromium. Now, common oxidation states vary from 0, 3 and 6. Among these, the 6 oxidation stage is more toxic. So, the trivalent form a great tendency to coordination with oxygen and nitrogen containing ligands. The hexavalent form is the most toxic of all the oxidation state of chromium. And if you consider the sources of chromium in the soil, soil parent material, industrial waste disposal like paper mill, petrochemicals, steel, paintings, platings, etc. Also fertilizers and sewage sludges as well as municipal effluents, all these are responsible for supplying the chromium in the soil. And also deposition of atmospheric particulates is also a source of chromium accumulation in soils. Now, if you see the chromium in the soil environment, the concentration of the chromium generally varies from 5 to 1000 ppm with a mean of 50 ppm. Now, distribution, if you see the distribution in the soil, chromium can be found at various depths in the soil profile, but the pattern of profile distribution of chromium are inconsistent. Now, what are the different phases of chromium? We have seen different phases of cadmium. Now, the different phases of chromium are oxidized or reduced phase, and oxidized or reduced phase, then you can see the dissolve in the soil solution, then you can see the adsorbed on the mineral and organic solid phases. The fourth phase is chelated by an organic ligand, and also you can see as chromium as precipitated as insoluble compounds. So, again it is oxidized and reduced phase, you can see dissolve in the soil solution. So, the solution phase, then adsorb on the mineral organic solid phases, you can see chelated form, you can also see, and precipitated form of chromium can also be found. So, what are the factors which affects the fate of chromium in the soil? Now, the major factors which affect the fate of the chromium in the soil are pH, oxidation state, electron donors or acceptors, organic acids, and also anaerobic environment. And each of them has profound influence on their fate, on the fate of chromium in the soil. For example, in the anaerobic environment with a low redox potential, that means with anaerobic condition and pH, chromium would exist in the chromium 3 state. So, it is relatively non-toxic. Now, what is the influence of organic acid like citric acid, gallic acid, acetic acid? These acid may serve as a chelators for a species like chromium 3 or electron donors for chromium 6. So, organic acid has a major influence on the mobility of the chromium, and also oxidation state, like increasing the toxicity of the compound of the hexavalent form is mobility. So, if you see the if you see side by side chromium 3 and chromium 6, you can be more the chromium 6 is more toxic to than than the chromium 3. So, oxidation state has a major influence. So, this is the factors which influences the fate of chromium in the soil. So, if you see the chromium toxicity, how chromium produces toxic influence in the animal body. So, you can see basically when chromium 6 diffuse within the nuclear membrane, it is basically the chromium 6 itself is not itself it is not producing any harmful effect. However, it is being reduced to chromium 3, and these reduction in chromium 3, this chromium 3 basically enters and then it produces different types of problem. For example, in case of high level damage, it can there are two types of damage when you can see from this chromium 3. One is low level damage, which basically double stranded breaks to single strand, which basically shows genomic instability. However, in case of high level damage, you can see the cell cycle arrest, which is known as apoptosis. Now, also these chromium 6 to chromium 3 transition may also turn into oxidative intermediates, for example, chromium 4, that means tetravalent chromium and also pentavalent chromium, and this and this tetravalent chromium and pentavalent chromium can also produces this genomic instability. And also it ultimately produces the oxidative damage of lipids and proteins, which can produce the mutation and cell transformation, which can ultimately produce the cancer. So, this is how the chromium can be a potential carcinogenic, and this is how the chromium produce the toxicity impacts in the cell. Remember that the chromium 6 itself is not acting, it is basically reducing into chromium 3, which enters into the cell to produce different types of ill effects. Now, if we move to the another important trace element, that is copper. Copper belongs to group 1b with an atomic weight of 63.546. In isotopes, it has 2 natural and 2 radioactive isotopes. 64 copper, which is a 64C, which is the half life of 128 hours, is the most commonly used as tracer, and common oxidation states are 1 and 2. And basically you can see the copper as copper sulphate, copper sulfur salts, copper carbonate, etc. in other forms. Now, what are the sources of copper? The sources of copper are parent material, industrial waste, food additive, disease and protection agents, fertilizers, manure, sludges and effluents, and high deposition of atmospheric particulate over a long distance from the emitting urban industrial sources. Now, what are the copper in soil environment? Now, if you see the copper in soil environment, concentration in soil basically varies from 1 to 50 ppm in agricultural soil, but 250 ppm is also registered. Now, distribution in the soils, if you see the least, it is the least mobile element and mostly uniformly distributed along the soil profile. And what are the different forms of copper in the soil? Majorly it can be found in soil solution, either ionic or complex form, in normal exchangeable site, on specific sorption sites, or it can be seen as an occluded in the soil oxide materials, as in and in organic residues. And also the copper can be found in the lattice structure of primary and secondary minerals. So, these are the different forms of copper which you can see in the soil environment. Now, what are the copper is found mostly in the organically bound fraction which dominate most arable soils. So, copper is one of the major trace element which shows tremendous binding capacity or tremendous affinity towards tendency to be bound by the organic molecules. So, the major inorganic forms of complex copper 2 in neutral and alkaline solution would be basically copper carbonate. Now, in case of highly carbonate alkaline soil, obviously there will be hydroxyl ions. So, obviously you can see the COOH4 2 minus anion become more predominant soluble species. Among the anions in the soil solution, sulphate and chloride may form complexes with Cu2 plus in a saline environment. The mobility and availability of copper depends on soil pH, organic matter content, the presence of iron, manganese and aluminum oxides and clay soil mineralogy. So, all these factors basically influences the mobility and availability of copper. So, the next major trace element, that is lead. Lead belongs to class 4A, group 4A, with an atomic weight of 207.19. Isotopes, as far as the isotopes are concerned, it has 4 stable isotopes and 1 radioactive isotope, that is 212 Pb with a half life of 10 hours. And common oxidation states are basically Pb2 and Pb4. Now, what are the major forms? The lead salt may be slightly soluble in water in case of chloride or bromide, if it is lead chloride or lead bromide, or almost insoluble if it is lead carbonate or lead hydroxides. So, what are the sources of lead? The major important source of lead in the environment is human activities. The use of different additives in gasoline constituents with all the consequent global contamination by particulate emissions, also accumulation near roadways, industrial use of urban areas, smelting, you can see the picture of smelting here in the steel industry, and also soil disposal of sewage, sludge and effluents, commercial fertilizers, all these are major source of sources of lead. And crop protection chemicals containing traces of lead could also increase the lead content of agricultural soil. So, basically we apply huge amount of pesticide that also can influence and increase the concentration of lead. We will discuss that in later in our next lecture when we discuss the organic organic pollutants of soil. Now, if we consider lead in soil environment, the concentration generally varies from less than 0.1 to 20 ppm, but in organic soil the concentration could be 3 times higher than this. Now, distribution in the soil, if you see the lead distribution in the soil, in soil profile decrease with depth because of its retention of the organic matter. Just like copper, lead also shows high affinity to be bound by organic matter. So, obviously, as the depth increases, as organic matter concentration decreases, lead concentration also decreases. So, what are the forms of lead? In arid soil, exchangeable sorbed organic carbonate and sulphide fractions have been found. In a humid area, hydrous oxides form have been detected, and under certain condition lead can be transformed by microorganisms, and a volatile compound tetramethyl lead has been detected, and the fate of lead in soils are controlled by the soil mechanical composition, mineralogy, organic matter content and solution pH. So, these are the major forms of lead in the soils. So, if you consider the next one, that is manganese. Manganese belongs to the group 7A with an atomic weight of 54.938, when it has 4 common oxidation state 2, 4, 6 and 7, and the forms are, if we consider the forms of manganese, the lower oxides of manganese are basic, whereas the higher oxides are basically acidic in nature. Now, what are the sources of manganese? Natural origin, manganese can occur naturally from metamorphic sedimentary and igneous rocks. You know that the differences between the metamorphic sedimentary and igneous rocks, and also due to human activity, manganese is basically used as fertilizer in inorganic or organic forms. In the organic forms, basically manganese EDTA, and in case of inorganic MNO form can be used. And also, if when we apply sewage sludge and effluents into the soil, that also behaves as a major source of manganese. And also aeolian sources like particulate emission from the iron and steel industry, and also fossil fuel combustion. So, these are the major sources of manganese in the environment. Now, if you consider the manganese in the soil environment, it co-precipitates with iron oxides. It exhibits the amphoteric behavior inherently, specifically with both anions and cations, and also the forms of soil manganese are water soluble, exchangeable, adsorbed, chelated or complexed with secondary clay minerals or primary minerals and insoluble metal oxides. So, basically you can see the manganese could be present as a water soluble form, exchangeable form, adsorbed form, chelated or complexed with secondary clay minerals or primary minerals or insoluble metal oxides. Manganese oxide, one of the major oxides present in the soils. And in the presence of organic matter, manganese complexes particularly with humic acid. So, basically also you can see the complexation of manganese with organic fraction of soil. Manganese availability changes with the changes of pH due to the complexation with organic matter. So, these are some of the important factors which which influence the manganese toxicity in the soil environment. First of all, the pH. pH is the most important factor determining the manganese toxicity in the soil. For example, if the soil is acidic in nature, that shows more concentration of manganese as compared to the alkaline soil. And another factor is soil properties and root exudates. So, manganese interaction with other ions may also affect its availability and toxicity. Let us consider the redox status. So, in the 3 and 4 oxidation states, manganese occur as precipitate in the oxidizing environment, whereas the manganese in oxidation state 2 is dominant in solution under reducing conditions. Now, addition of iron to the soil solution may reduce the manganese toxicity. And the presence of organic matter in soil as well as the application of chelators through fertilizer can affect the existing status of manganese in the soil environment. So, obviously, the presence of organic matter through its chelating action also can affect the status of manganese in the soil environment. Now, let us consider one of the major important trace element as far as the toxicity is concerned, that is mercury. Now, mercury belongs to group 2b with an atomic weight of 200.59. It has 7 stable isotopes and it has 3 common oxidation states 0, 1 and 2. And what are the important forms? The forms are, it may be found in stable mercuric sulfide and sulfur salts or in the form of inorganic or organic complexes. We will see that in details. Now, in the nature, the major sources if you consider the major sources, mercury occurs in all kinds of rocks, mainly as sulfide, as we have already discussed. And also it has got anthropogenic sources like agriculture, industrial uses, combustion of fossil fuels, chlorine manufacturing, then mercury mining and smelting, etc. So, all these processes influences the concentration or enrichment of mercury in the soil environment. Now, what are the different forms of mercury? Mercury is very unstable in the soil environment, you have to remember that. Now, remember that organic and inorganic compounds are decomposed by biological process and form elemental mercury, which may volatilize or be converted to mercuric sulfide or complex with inorganic ligands. So, basically organic inorganic compounds are decomposed by biological process for form elemental mercury, and these elemental mercury produce also can be volatilized and then converted to mercuric sulfide or complex with inorganic ligands. Now, one of the important thing is this mercury could be strongly chelated by soil organic matter, and humic substances containing sulfur keep mercury in a soluble form. Now, the inorganic complexes of so we have covered the organic forms. Now, inorganic complexes of mercury too are mainly formed with chloride and hydroxide and become fairly stable in water. Now, sometimes we see precipitation of mercury occurred only if the concentration of mercury 2 and HgOH2 exceed 207 ppm. So, these are different forms of mercury which we can see in the soil environment. Now, let us talk about mercury toxicity. Mercury is the only metal that is liquid at room temperature, and the metal is basically used in electric discharge tube like mercury lamps, then pressure gauges in laboratories and dental amalgams, and also mercury salts are also used as fungicides. Now, inorganic mercury are not very toxic if swallowed, and most of the salts are excreted unchanged from the body. Now, mercury toxicity, mercury compounds which are very volatile or soluble are potential hazardous for human systems. Fortunately, most of the compounds of mercury are insoluble, so they do not cause toxicity. Now, mercury vapor however is very toxic. If inhaled, it passes into the bloodstream and digestive system and the lungs and is transported to our brain. So, symptoms of mercury poisoning include depression, irritability, shaking of the hands and psychotic behavior. Okay. So, these are some of the ill effects of mercury toxicity. Now, organic mercury salts are much more toxic than inorganic salts. Mercury reacts by replacing the 2 hydrogen atoms in a sulfhydryl groups. The field sulfhydryl, so sulfhydryl group is basically SH group. So, mercury basically reacts by replacing the 2 hydrogen from atom in a sulfhydryl group. So, the free sulfhydryl groups are essential for the enzyme's activity. When the bond with the metal is formed, the enzyme becomes inactive. So, these are some of the effect of mercury toxicity, you can see here. So, proteins basically play an important part in cells as enzymes which catalyze biological process and as constituents of cell membrane. Now, when enzyme becomes inactive, biological processes in cells are disturbed and symptoms of the mercury poisoning are seen. So, you can see here it is showing the high toxicity of mercury, that is called the mercurialism, and basically it is called also known as the pink disease or acrodynia. It produces pink discoloration as well as pain, and also you can see Minamata disease from mercury, which ultimately produces impairment of speech and hearing. Now, naturally during the eruption of volcanoes, mercury is disposed into the atmosphere, and burning coal also does the same. Although mercury is only 1 ppm in coal, combustion of coal releases about 5,000 tons of mercury into the atmosphere every year. So, this you can see that anthropogenic sources are major anthropogenic sources are the major source of mercury toxicity. Now, remember that in industry producing sodium hydroxide and chlorine by electrolysis of the brine, some mercury is regularly lost through the waste product into the river water, where it is consumed by fishes, and finally due to the it enters into the chain, food chain, and basically it comes into the human body. Now, few years ago, mercury poisoning by eating fishes are recorded in Japan as Minamata epidemic, and I have showed you in the last slide the picture of Minamata disease due to mercury toxicity. Another important trace element is molybdenum. We denote this molybdenum as Mo. It belongs to group 6b with an atomic weight of 95.94. It has got 5 isotopes, and common oxidation states are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. However, the predominant are 4 and 6, and it basically basically occurs in dilute solutions, basically predominates in dilute solution, and basically the sources of molybdenum are parent materials and also the fertilizers in the soil, sewage and sludge, coal combustion, and different mining process. So, you can see that these are some of the important trace elements which are responsible for causing the soil pollution. So, let us wrap up our lecture here. We will start from here in the next lecture, and then we will discuss some of the important organic pollutants also. Thank you very much.